Welcome to There Is a Method to the Madness. My name is Rob Maxwell. I'm an exercise physiologist and personal trainer. I'm the owner of Maxwell's fitness programs and have been in business since 1994. I want to first thank our sponsors this morning, Jonathan and Lynn Gilden of the Gilden Group at Realty Pros. They are flat out the best around. Realty Pros is number one in Volusia County, and I know Jonathan and Lynn, and they're awesome. They will meet your needs. Customer service is where it's at, my friends. They can be reached at thegildengroup.com, gildengroup.com. All right, you beer-bellied besties out there, beer-bellied billies. Let's talk about that. Who has a beer belly? So that question came up the other day. And, sometimes people think, well, I don't want to ask that because I don't know, maybe it's just silly or whatever. But sometimes it's these questions that people ask that are actually very, very interesting. And when someone asks me, like, is there such a thing, or like, is it the fact that people are just putting on weight and it's a typical guy thing, whatever. But there's truth to the old beer belly, all right, the alcohol belly. So let the method to the madness break this down for you a little bit. All right, so first, when we think of beer belly, we often think of men more than women. The reason for that is because, for the most part, men and women have different shapes of obesity, all right? So what that means is there's such a thing called android obesity and gynoid obesity. Men, if they get obese, tend to go more in the direction of android obesity, and that is the classic apple shape. So it is more thick around the middle, thick around the midsection, thick in the belly. Women, if they happen to become obese, are more what we call gynoid obesity, and that is more obesity in the hips, obesity in the thighs. All right, so lower bodies are bigger. Men seem to have bigger trunks. So that's one reason why we may notice that a little more. And that could potentially be one reason why we might call something a beer belly in a guy, especially if they drink. We're just going to assume that. But some of it is just body type. Now, before I move on, I must say that gynoid obesity is far more healthier than android obesity. So having a lot of fat or subcutaneous fat, which is adipose tissue around your internal organs, is not very healthy. So if we are going to choose the lesser of the two evils, then gynoid obesity is far healthier. It is a lot better to carry our subcutaneous fat in our lower part of our body versus our midsection. So there is that. All right. Next. So another thing that happens when people drink too much. So there is a hardening of the stomach that tends to happen. We get sort of a dissension of the stomach. We tend to get a hardening of the abdominal region once we get into some more alcoholic style of drinking. So we will see some of that. That absolutely does happen, and it makes the stomach appear to be very, very large. I shouldn't say appear to be very large, because it is definitely larger and, say, more bloated. So that does tend to occur when people drink too much. So there is some sense to the effect that there is a beer belly with that. So there is some of that too. So there's just a lot of variables. I hope you're picking up on that. There's a lot of variables. There's body type. There is the bloating that does seem to occur when people drink all alcohol, not necessarily beer. So I probably should qualify that right away and say there's nothing evil about beer compared to vodka. I just think maybe it gets that reputation because people can drink more beer than vodka, except I guess if you're Otis in Mayberry, I guess you can throw down that bottle of whiskey as well. But I think you get my overall point on this. The other thing that might be a variable is that not all calories or not all nutrients or not all things we bring in are the same. I don't want to call alcohol an essential nutrient because it's actually not. It is not needed by the body, but it is something we bring in calorically. And for each gram of alcohol, there is 7 calories. Compare that to carbohydrates, there is 4. Compare that to protein, there is 4. Compare that to fat, there is 9. So alcohol does have more caloric input per capita, per size than carbohydrates and protein. So then there's also that variable. So in other words, a little bit of alcohol is more calorically dense than a little bit of fruits and vegetables or lean protein sources. So there's that variable. And then finally, it's really as simple as this. When we drink too much, it's like eating too much. We are going to store what we don't use as adipose tissue, as subcutaneous body fat. I mean, that's just what we're going to do. Now, this is a generalization, but oftentimes people that are drinking enough to be accused of having a beer belly, not all the time, but generalized speaking here, then they're probably not exercising and working out. So a lot of what they're gaining is going to be fat and not muscle. So in other words, any caloric surplus is going to lead to weight gain. If you're working out, doing a lot of weights, and the calories are of quality calories, but most importantly, you're doing a lot of weights, then a lot of the weight that you're going to gain is going to be muscle. So any surplus is going to create weight gain. If you're working out, the weight is going to be hopefully more muscle than fat. If you're not working out, it's going to be more fat than muscle. I mean, how can muscles grow if you aren't challenging them? So oftentimes when people are drinking to the point of being accused of having a beer belly, or that's the assumption, then oftentimes they're not working out. So they're really just gaining weight. They're gaining fat. And remember, this is often seems to be the accusations go more towards men than women. And if you remember, based on where men store their fat, they're simply gaining more fat around the middle, the midsection. So they're gaining more fat because that's where men gain it, a lot more than they gain it in their hips and anywhere else. It eventually distributes everywhere else, but they're going to gain more of their subcutaneous fat, their adipose tissue around the middle. So really, then there is that. So along with that term, sometimes what's thrown around in just general speak, just general terminology, obviously nothing scientific or fancy, but the old saying skinny fat. So he looks skinny fat. So that means that the person doesn't have a lot of meat on their arms, doesn't have a lot of meat on their legs, but they're carrying that paunchy belly. They're carrying that, again, the beer belly, right? So then another way it's sometimes termed, not in a favorable way. I mean, right? Any of these terms, you might be listening to this going, well, geez, I don't know what's worse, being accused of having a beer belly or accusing yourself or being called skinny fat. Well, obviously nobody wants to be called anything, and we probably need to stay in our own lane and not call people things anyway, right? But that is a term that's thrown around quite a bit, but it means the same thing. So again, if you're not exercising, so the legs aren't going to get any muscle, and exercising is walking. It's all of it. So if you're walking a lot, you're going to work on the muscles of your thighs and calves. So that's going to create some hypertrophy there. So you're going to have some muscles there. But if you're not exercising and you're taking in a surplus of calories that you don't need, and you're a man, which typically have android obesity, then you are going to store that fat around the midsection. That's simply what is going to happen. So that is most of what a beer belly is. Again, though, if somebody is drinking alcoholically, and that is obviously nothing to make fun of, that person needs help. If you're that concerned about that, then obviously you need to talk to them about maybe getting some help, because that's one of their issues, that they might be carrying around fat. But the bigger issue is the fact that that's an illness in itself that needs to be treated. But so if person is drinking alcoholically like that, then yes, there's going to be bloatedness in the stomach, literally in the stomach. There's going to be bloatedness, and there's going to be inflammation within all of the digestive organs, such as the liver, the intestines. There's going to be inflammation. There's going to be bloatedness, and we're going to start to see that descended belly a little bit, sticking out puffy hard. And you might be seeing some of that as well. Not the person that asked this question, by the way. I must clarify in this case, they're really just curious about it because they hear that a lot. And I think they're just more or less trying to describe why there seems to be that little, belly in a lot of men, but not a lot of obesity everywhere else compared to what they're seeing in the general population with women. And again, so much of that is just the old body type of what kind of obesity. All right. So I hope that sums it up. So it's a little bit of everything, kind of like weight loss and weight gain is a little bit of everything. We can't necessarily pinpoint it to just one thing. There's just a lot of variables, and everybody's an individual, and anybody is struggling with, any form of obesity, I would hope that they would look for some help, because, it is the number one risk factor as far as leading to cardiovascular events. So it is something to be treated. It is a health crisis. It's not an appearance crisis. It is a health crisis. And if you're concerned about somebody, it's like everything else, how do you start to help them a little bit? So, all right. So what do we do about all that? So, the last thing I can leave you with on that, and I'm just going to get into one part of this because this is all about the old quote beer belly, and I'm not going to get into this whole trans-theoretical model of change, because that could be an entire podcast, but I'll leave you with this first part of it. And it basically says that if somebody isn't really overly ready to change, that is called pre-contemplation, meaning they're not even contemplating change yet. So in other words, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your friend, maybe it's somebody and you notice that they're gaining weight around the midsection, and you're worried about them because that could be a precursor to a cardiac event later on. So you're worried, but let's say they're not. All right. That's called pre-contemplation. They're not contemplating any change yet. Studies show that badgering them, any of the things that we might do, doesn't work. The best thing you can do, there's two things you can do. You can be a role model for yourself. We call that social learning theory. So if you are changing yourself, and every time you see them start to work in an area that is beneficial to them, you reinforce it, you give them the old that boys, that will go somewhere. That's positive. The other thing is education, not badgering, education, meaning, leave stuff rolling around. Well, not them, hopefully. Leave stuff lying around on the tables, little brochures here and there, handouts, maybe watch a documentary, but definitely do it in a way where the person isn't feeling attacked, because then they're going to go in the complete opposite direction. Later on, there's other things you can do. Once they get into the contemplation stage and they're willing to at least admit that there's a problem, there's a health issue somewhere, they're far more likely to seek advice, and you're going to be better received. But until then, the best you can do is be the role model that, as Gandhi says, be the change you wish to see, and then simply maybe slyly leave stuff laying around. All right. Because yes, beer bellies can be problematic down the road. None of us like that. All right. So thank you, Daytona Beach's own overhead door company. They're sponsors of the MaxFit Games, as the Gildan Group are. They're the best garage door company around. Customer service is where it's at. And I have mentioned over and over, like, we don't even have an overhead door, not because I didn't want one, but because when I moved into my house, it didn't have one. But even still, Zach Hawk, one of the owners, comes out and checks it out. Anytime I say it's allowed, he shows up, he checks it out. I mean, they're on the ball. They're always answering their phones. I have clients that use them. They have the absolute best reputation there is in customer service. So we thank them very much, and we will talk tomorrow.